Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you are joining us for our series on Philanthropy in the City, where we explore the opportunities for innovative, creative solutions for the most pressing problems in our neighborhoods, communities, and cities. As the center embarks on its third decade, we are excited to shine a spotlight on how philanthropy can contribute to improving the quality of life in all of our communities. You will hear from leaders from across the nation, leaders with a wide range of experiences, perspectives, and vantage points, who will share their insights and ideas for building more vibrant, equitable, and resilient cities. A fundamental change in philanthropy over this generation has been a focus on greater impact, not merely doing good. The beginning of this period, dating back to the mid-1990s, was marked by venture philanthropy with an emphasis on more strategic giving and nonprofit capacity building. Next came strategies to scale impact, philanthropic collaboration, public policy engagement, and partnering with government and business. And in more recent years, attention has extended to reimagining philanthropic practices, notably impact investing and prioritizing diversity and inclusion. Here at the center, we have devoted much of our efforts to examining and assessing these strategies, where philanthropy works at the intersection of the sectors through public policy and partnerships with government and business, as well as efforts to support greater philanthropic collaboration. In the process, we have learned that the greatest opportunity for philanthropy to drive change is at the local level, in our cities and their neighborhoods and communities. It is at that scale that you can see, feel, and touch the problems. It is at that scale that you're more apt to see how the various systems come together to create a place and impact the quality of life. It is also a scale in which we can involve all of philanthropy and bring the community together from all the sectors, all walks of life to solve problems, including addressing the issue of equity. Government can't do it alone, business cannot do it alone, and surely philanthropy cannot do it on its own. We only can do it together. And at the city level, the opportunities expand exponentially across the philanthropic spectrum. Over the last year, this has come into greater focus as the issues of equity and race have been laid bare. There's an amazing possibility for our cities to meet the moment and for philanthropy to play an important role. It is our hope that this series will explore the possibilities, highlight work being done in a number of cities and their communities, and spark a conversation that shares ideas and lessons across communities. Today, as we kick off the series, we will explore the new localism, how the vitality and promise of cities and how emerging models for working across the sectors for local problem solving can play a transformative role. We believe that at this moment, with its heightened urgency, it is critical that we identify promising opportunities and double down on them. It is our hope that this series will lift up new ideas, innovative approaches, and bold leadership to spark the action that is needed to realize the promise of philanthropy and the city. Let's get to it. I'm pleased to introduce my good friend, colleague, and thought partner, Elwood Hopkins. Elwood is the founder and managing director of Emerging Markets and currently a presidential fellow at the Kresge Foundation. Elwood.
American cities confront a crisis of tremendous proportions: global pandemic, economic downturn, failing formulas for municipal finance, and a reckoning around long-standing racial disparities. At the same time, much responsibility for addressing these challenges has been left to cities to handle without corresponding resources or authorities. As a result, private, philanthropic, and nonprofit actors are stepping in at the local level, and new cross-sector partnership structures are emerging. At this moment of transition, it's worth asking whether these new local problem-solving structures may contain the seeds for new urban practice and policy and for the inclusive recovery of American cities. This is the question we'll address in this first installment in the USC Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy's Philanthropy in the City series, with two of the center's most admired thought leaders, advisors, and friends. In fact, we have two of the most preeminent statesmen in urban practice and policy with us today. Henry Cisneros, founder and chairman of CityView and former president of Univision, former mayor of San Antonio in the 80s, and of course, the Honorable Secretary of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development in the 90s is with us. Also, one of our nation's philanthropic treasures and thought leaders, Rip Rapson, president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, whose philanthropic leadership, in particular in Detroit, after its bankruptcy and through its recovery, has really remodeled new philanthropic relations and provided new solutions for how foundations can play catalytic roles in cities. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to start with a baseline question. You are both, in my mind, two of the greatest steadfast champions of cities, and you eloquently argue for the importance of cities and the advancement of society. And so that's where I'd like to start. Let's check in with you. Given the anti-urban biases that are increasingly predominant in some policy discussions, articles in the Atlantic suggesting that the age of cities is in danger because we're shifting to working and shopping remotely. How do you both feel? Are your convictions around cities and their centrality to policy unshaken? And Henry, I think I'd start with you. What do you see as the most valuable functions of cities, and what do you consider to be their importance in society? And also, what have been some of the biases against cities you've had to contend with?
When scholars, writers, observers talk about the United States being a metropolitan nation, and in some sense, just having in the last several decades become a metropolitan nation, I agree. I think we're headed in the direction of more significance, more dominance for urban areas than ever. And you've seen the references to the global situation where, for the first time in the history of humankind, more people now live in urban areas than live in rural areas. And that just happened a decade or so ago that we crossed that threshold. But all the trends go in the direction of greater urbanization, more density, more economic role for these places we call cities. I like to think about cities in the context of history. They play a very important role. Authors have called them one of the most important inventions of the human experience because we have to have them. They provide huge functions, especially in an era of specialization where people have to depend upon each other and are more interdependent. And they are living organisms that we have to think about as what they need to be nurtured, why they came into being, what their economic functions are. So I'm very bullish on the role that cities will play going forward. I do think we have to recognize that those roles change. What was once cities as manufacturing centers, for example, 30% of the jobs in most American cities after World War II were manufacturing. There are very few places in America where anything more than 10% of the jobs is manufacturing. But the cities have sort of created a new economic rationale, new media, hospitality, international trade, biomedicine, technology, business services. All of those things have come together and created a new economic rationale. And it means not only that we have to recognize the significance of those industries nationally and how they work in cities, but then we have to think about the city themselves, how cities support those industries, how cities nurture their role with respect to them. We are clearly a metropolitan nation and becoming more so. I'll close just by reciting Bruce Katz's analysis. He was my chief of staff when I was Secretary of HUD, and he did a tremendous job. But then he went on, as you know, to great plaudits as the head of the Brookings Metropolitan Center. And he wrote the book in which he said something like 66% of the American people live in just the 100 largest metros. 66% of our population, but they produce 78% of our GDP. Just the 100 largest metros, 78% of the national economy is blossoming there. I think it speaks to a greater role for our cities and metros.
Your conviction's intact. It's hard to argue with that. Rip, what is it about cities for you, or the processes they put in motion, that feels crucial to America right now?
Oh, Elwood, I didn't realize you wanted me to talk. Can I just sort of listen to Henry and take notes with you?
At that point.
You know, to be lumped in the category of statesman with Henry Cisneros is as close to blasphemy as you will ever get. So it's a pleasure. No, I think the secretary is absolutely right. And I do think that the role that cities will play in the future, not just sort of in this post-COVID moment, but sort of generally, is changing dramatically. And along the sort of the trajectory that Henry laid out. I mean, first, if we are going to construct a crucible to come to terms with issues of racial equity and justice, it will be in our cities. That's where we've got to rebuild the hardware of racial justice, and that's where we've got to find the new apps and redesign the software for racial justice, whether it's coming to terms with our history, becoming comfortable with changing and emerging identities, and healing and reconciliation. This is going to be, I think, a major role for the people in cities to play through. And not, again, that the rest of the country won't have to participate in that, but I think that cities will be the front line. I think we're also going to see in cities a very different evolution of problem-solving machinery for society's most intractable issues. I think we no longer really have a sort of a strict command and control way of making decisions at any level of government, certainly not in cities, where you have a much more distributive quality of leadership with all sectors of society, the private sector, the public sector, the civic sector, the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector, all trying to figure out what their tools are and how they can contribute in common purpose to issues from climate change to health to community development. And so I think as cities become more sophisticated about how to blend all of those pieces, you're going to see a very different way of coming at problems. Third, and perhaps in a related vein, I think we're going to figure out that policy at the city level translates into implementation capacity. That we have a lot of good policy on the books, a lot of bad policy on the books. We have a lot of policy on the books that just doesn't get us where we need to go without the ability to cut to the question of how we're going to deliver those policies. How are you going to marshal the resources? How are you going to set the question? How are you going to distribute solutions, particularly capital? And I think that, again, it is sort of at the ground level where that implementation capacity is going to be stress tested and reinvented. And finally, and I think Henry alluded to this, I think cities are the right scale. You know, there was a long time where we thought that cities were too small to be significant economic players or social players. But I think that is no longer the case. I think it is at the city level that you can kind of grab the web whole, to borrow Robert Kennedy's phrase, where you can look at all of the systems, begin to understand how they play back and forth, how they ricochet, how they recombine, how they do all of the things that complex systems do, and then pull them back together into something that is coherent and compelling. It's really the place where citizens can control their own destiny, hold themselves accountable, and hold their leaders accountable. So for me, cities have never been more important, and I think we're entering a period in which they're going to be even more important.
You've both laid out so many topics here, and I'd like to, if possible, unbundle each of them if we can. I'm mindful, first of all, though, of the immense experience that's encompassed by each of your respective careers. And, you know, you've been leaders and observers of urban policy and practice through multiple chapters of its evolution. So I was hoping you might help us ground our conversation in your personal historical perspective in public policy and philanthropy. Henry, what changes have you witnessed since your time as mayor of San Antonio and then Secretary of Housing and Urban Development? And what should we be keeping in mind about the changes that have taken place around the role of the public sector in cities?
Well, first of all, let me say the most important experience of my life, apart from marrying my wife and having children and being close to my extended family was the opportunity to be mayor of San Antonio, my hometown. I have said to people over the years, I feel toward San Antonio as toward a member of my family. Yes, there are flaws, but we stick through it thick and thin, and we work through things. And I love the place. I love cities generally, but I love this particular city a great deal. I came to the business of cities in 1968. I was a student at Texas A&M University, and I remember the night that Dr. King was assassinated, and the cities were burning all across America. I had known I wanted to do something in the service field, but it would probably have been something more institutional, foreign service, the military, something of that nature. But that experience and what followed that year of 1968, which many have called one of the most tumultuous years in American history, perhaps until 2020, taught me that one could make a life working at this urban business. So everything I did after that, I worked at the National League of Cities in Washington while in graduate school in Washington, had the opportunity to work with Mayor Carl Stokes, who at that point was the first African-American mayor of a major northern city. Mayor Lindsay was the mayor in New York. What an inspiration he was. Mayor Daley was still running Chicago. Tommy D'Alessandro was the mayor of Baltimore. What an experience for a 23-year-old. I decided at that moment that that's where I wanted to make my life, working in cities. So I came home and ran for city council, served 6 years on the council, and then was elected mayor at 33. And nothing that I have done since. I've been a cabinet officer. I've been a business executive. I've owned businesses, served on national commission. Nothing resembles the level of complete engagement, 24/7, sense of ownership, sense of being able to move things that I had as mayor. I say to people that at the end of my tenure, I felt like an orchestra conductor who knew that if you moved your left hand, the bass would come up. If you move your right, you could get the trumpets to come up. You could set the rhythm. But that sense of being an orchestrator of all of the great moving parts, not just the city government. In terms of what a mayor does, the city government is a relatively small part of the resources you have at your command, because you can call on philanthropy, you can call on education, you can call on hospitals, you can call on a broader range of public safety officials. You have a relationship with your county and regional governments. But if you're doing it right and you're consulting with people and you set the vision in such a way that everybody is working in the same direction, it's amazing the way a city works. Now, I'll close by saying, to answer your question about what has changed, what has changed, I think, in the 30 or so years that I've been in this business is that more and more people have realized that that is the way cities work. And what used to be thought of as the level you look to for action was the federal government. We've long understood that that's not where you're going to get response that's timely or to scale or to the point. And the state governments, most of them have very little sense of how to relate to cities. They have big responsibilities like the state highway system or the state universities or maybe the state healthcare strategies, and they impact cities, but they don't drive what happens in our cities. It is the people in the cities. And so I think we recognize more and more the significance of mayors. We have 3 of them in the cabinet right now, 3 former mayors, and the way that all of the other non-governmental pieces can be brought to bear to really make a city go. And Rip, of course, has been on the forefront in Detroit, but all over America, we're seeing that dynamic play out. And whether it was, we have national figures who've emerged from that experience, like Cory Booker out of Newark, for example. And it's where the action is if we want to make change. And let me just say, we've known for a long time that cities are places where we live, and they're places where we work, And they're places where we trade, and they're places where we learn, and they're places where we assemble to do great things together, religious, political, or otherwise. But cities have also been the places where we achieve some measure of equity in American society. Since immigrants arrived with nothing to the east side of New York and made a life, investment banks named for Jewish immigrants from New York, right? Bank of America in San Francisco, named after an Italian, named by an Italian American in San Francisco. We've known that that's the dynamic, but I think we're entering into an era where conscious attention to the equity agenda with city resources and the other resources they can bring to bear is the next great role of our cities in our society.
That's a wonderful point. And we're going to return to the equity question in just a minute. Also wanted to highlight that power of cities, that mayoral leadership experience as a source of national leadership for our problem solving. Rip, a slightly pivoted version of the same question. Reflecting from your days in city government in Minneapolis all the way through your leadership of Kresge, what changes have you seen, especially relative to philanthropy's role in cities, and how has that landscape evolved in your eyes?
It's almost incomprehensibly different, Elwood. I remember being in the mayor's office, 20, 25 years ago, and hoping that philanthropy could come to our aid in a very ambitious neighborhood revitalization project we were launching, and they were just nowhere to be found. It just wasn't in their repertoire to figure out how to deal with the public sector. We were sort of poison to them, and so the more arm's length, the better. And I think when you look at the philanthropic ecology now, it is so incredibly diverse. Think of all of the sort of the new tech money, the new next generation wealth donors. McKinsey, Scott Bezos has $2 billion to promote racial justice organizations across the country. But beyond just the sort of the more money and more players, I think the roles have changed rather dramatically. I think way back 10 years ago, to say nothing of 20, philanthropy was very reluctant to sort of get out of its passive crouch and to do much more than be responsive. And I think you're seeing more and more, not just private foundations, but community foundations, corporate foundations, sort of leaning into these hard strategic questions of how do you gather multiple resources and line them up with public resources and private resources to help advance issues of importance to communities. I think as a result, you're also seeing a real blurring of traditional sectoral lines. Is that whereas I couldn't get philanthropy to cooperate with the public sector right now, philanthropy is eager to cooperate with the public sector and eager to cooperate with the private sector, at least certain kinds of philanthropy. And so you get this kind of mixing and matching that I think Henry referred to, which is sort of certifying a question at the local level and then figuring out what resources can be orchestrated, using a mayor who is skillful at orchestration to pull these pieces together to make sure that people are putting the right tools in play and the right doses and the right sequences, and ultimately getting real traction on the issues that challenge us. And I would just also put in a plug to the rest of the center's agenda, because I think the role of community foundations has become really powerful. Many community foundations are still a little bit hamstrung by donor-advised funds and needing to pay deep, deep attention to donors. They all do. But I think you see in people like Fred Blackwell or Antonia Hernandez, people like Bob Ross, and just on, folks who are willing to take the role of a community foundation or a regional foundation, in the case of the California Endowment, and become a major civic player in partnership with the mayor, of course, but nevertheless independent of the mayor and bringing a whole set of different resources to the table. And if I could, just very quickly, beyond the sort of the complexity of the environment and the changed aspirations of the environment, I think there's some pretty specific roles that philanthropy has come to accept as part of its contribution to the civic fabric. One is table setting, just getting people together around the really tough questions that perhaps a public sector official can't take on, or that's just way beyond the remit of a corporate sector. Philanthropy can help capacity building. In Detroit, for example, we had no community development finance institutions within the boundaries of the city of Detroit in 2010. That just wasn't acceptable. We needed to figure out mechanisms to move capital to ground, and so we were able to help build the capacity of that sector. Philanthropy can often de-risk really complex transactions if the private sector doesn't want to get near. But once those transactions are de-risked and we can actually have some proof points, the markets can kind of move in the direction of greater acceptance of some of those kinds of projects and tools. And again, I think that's in many ways what led to the success of Detroit's rebound, was the demonstration to the private sector that you could actually get things done in places that had traditionally been disinvested, and ideas that were just too hot to handle. Fourth, I think philanthropy has realized that it has a unique role in helping be a sort of a guarantor of the civic commons, of investing in places that signal both to residents and to private sector investors that this place is here to stay. I think of again, an example in Detroit of investing in our Riverwalk. No one could have done that with just public sector resources, or actually even with private sector resources. We needed all sectors of society to come to the table and build out a civic commons that became the backbone of the revitalization of the city's downtown. And finally, I think philanthropy does a good job in bridging to other resources, whether it's other philanthropic resources or to private resources or to other resources from different levels of government. We can talk more about later, but essentially, I think it was the role of that bridge-like kind that helped Detroit attract the federal government and under the Obama administration into Detroit with the kinds of resources it needed to put up in order to help the city get back on its feet.
Wow, that's quite a blueprint, reflecting a lot of experience. Let's discuss local cross-sector partnership configurations, which have been a theme in both of your remarks so far, and how they're sort of arising to solve problems in cities. And let's surface not only some real-world examples, if we can, but let's delve into the process of their formation, the organizing principles, if you will, that drive them and that enable partners to, as you said, Rip, sit down at the same table, realign their roles, create something with perpetual motion. And Henry, let's start with sort of what you see as you survey American cities and the examples of private, philanthropic, and nonprofit sectors stepping in to do some of the heavy lifting where city governments can't do it all. And I'm mindful of your sense of being an orchestra conductor. How do you get the strings to play with the woodwinds, to play with the brass? Like, how do they work off the same sheet music? And what's relevant to our time now?
Well, let me start with my personal experience. In the years that I was studying to be mayor, that is to say, I was on the city council, I was a graduate student, et cetera, I learned about efforts in cities across America where they set up goal-setting efforts. One of the most prominent way back when was a thing called Goals for Dallas from Mayor Eric Johnson in 1968, which resulted in the vision of creating DFW Airport, which has made Dallas into sort of the Chicago equivalent in the heartland of the country with a southern face, and undoubtedly one of the more dynamic places in the United States. I created in 1983, something called Target 90, Target to 1990, 7 years. I didn't want to get way out into Buck Rogers territory, Target 2000. So I picked 1990, which is 7 years, and about the time it takes to get things done. If you're talking about major infrastructure, major projects, to raise the capital, do a bond issue, get something done, and brought together what ended up being about 500 people. Philanthropy was deeply involved. The business sector was involved. The co-chairs were an Anglo business leader of the community, ran Hart Hanks Communications, an African-American legislator, and a community organizing Latino. I asked them to be the co-chairs, as I did create tri-chairs for almost everything I did in that era. And they came up with something with these 500 people in 12 task forces, about 140 goals for the city, most of which, the vast majority of which, have actually been accomplished, not on my watch, but in the years since. But the important thing about that effort was not the goal setting, the projects per se. It was 500 leaders of the community got to know each other and got to think in terms of how we're in this together, and got to see each other's interests and what it would take to get things done. So when it came time to execution, like passing a bond issue, which we did almost every year after that to meet these priorities, the base of support, the leadership support was already there. So one model is efforts to bring the community together. And I've seen them since in places like Denver and Seattle and many others where that model was used to bring people together, to set the table, as Rip said, get the people together, understand what we're working on together, have some sense of why we need to go in this direction, and really develop a sense of conviction. Other instances are more sort of one-off. When I was the community organizers from the community asked me to go to Baltimore and see a program called the Baltimore Education Partnership, which Mayor Schaefer had put in place there. And it was to make it, he basically wanted to make the promise: every graduate of a Baltimore public high school will have the money to go to college. Money will not be an impediment to keep you from being able to go to college. And he had to raise corporate and philanthropic dollars to do it. I came home excited about it and started the San Antonio Education Partnership, but we needed philanthropy. The head of the Chamber of Commerce agreed to serve as the primary fundraiser for the effort. And we were able to make a promise by the end of that year that in the 6th poorest performing schools in San Antonio, if you achieved a B average and 95% attendance, you would have the money you need to go to college. That is now expanded to all the high schools in San Antonio with major philanthropic involvement. A place called Cafe College, which is sort of college advising central, right? Now think about this. It's not the mayor's job to work on education. We have school districts that are separate. It's not the mayor's job to think about college accession and college scholarships and college admissions. But because those were so essential to our vision of how do we build a functioning city with an economy that works and workers to support it and brain power, nobody objected to the mayor playing that role. And we were able to get this started. It has since graduated into really major things. In fact, this November, we passed a sales tax increase during the pandemic, passed a sales tax increase to fund a $54 million worker training initiative related to this partnership. So those are sort of some models that you sometimes they're large and broad, sometimes they're project specific, but it all starts with bringing the right people together and setting the goals and articulating our common interest.
Rip, does Henry's description of people being able to redefine roles in the context of big, audacious goals resonate with you? I'm guessing it does. And I'm wondering, as you think about cross-sector partnerships, I know you work across the country, but I'm wondering if you might draw on some examples in Detroit, because although you've exercised great humility about not wanting to assume that things that were successful in Detroit should be replicated elsewhere. I think at this moment in history, people are wondering, did Detroit's experience in crisis, especially with cross-sector partnership, does it have anything to show us?
Let me just first say I couldn't agree more with Henry's formulation. I think the headline is almost as much about the process as it is about the projects. And Henry put a figure on it exactly, that this is about assembling people, again, in the right combinations with the right tasks and the right objectives and pushing together in concerted purpose. So just bravo to that. Second, in some ways, I think particularly in the period going forward, Detroit is a little bit of a mini America. We went through not just the bankruptcy, but a period of crisis before the bankruptcy that involved automobile bankruptcies, the Great Recession, the housing implosion, and a scandal that landed most of City Hall in the federal penitentiary. And so how you kind of get your bearings and assemble your resources and get clarity of forward purpose in place is a really important question. And my bias, which I think Henry shares, is that you can do that only with cross-sector partnerships. And in Detroit, which is an extreme example, but again, I think it is in some ways illustrative of other places, we fundamentally use that device to recreate literally every public system in the city of Detroit. Land use, we started a whole new community engagement effort that led to a new intermediary that sort of was the steward of land use policies. Entrepreneurship, we set up a whole new infrastructure to promote small business development and entrepreneurialism. Early childhood development, there was no system. We've gone systematically, step by step, toward making one, creating these open spaces I talked about earlier, not just the riverfront, but the downtown park system and trail system that threads throughout the region. The food system, we put the Eastern Market, the world's oldest and largest market, the nation's oldest and largest market, into a conservancy structure that was governed and operated by a cross-sectoral partnership. And then perhaps most audaciously, we created a new transit system that was designed, planned, and initially funded by the philanthropic and private sectors, but ultimately drew in the public sectors as it certainly needed to. And so I think the methodology of partnership is a really understood asset in these places. Again, it's a little bit of a movement away from the kind of command and control mindset that I think we often attach to public sector decision making. And again, the mayor always has the election certificate, always has responsibility and accountability. But at the end of the day, he or she is much more effective by moving out in exactly the way Henry has described, and trying to mobilize and motivate and make greater coherence, all of the different elements of society that need to lean in. And we've got other examples, but maybe we can come back to them.
Well, I have a quick follow-up question, and it's about how you it's a governance question. As sectors start to come together to work in creative ways, sometimes they do it without the formal authority or the kind of compensatory funding you'd expect. But I'm thinking, for example, in Detroit, what happens as equilibrium is restored in Detroit and there's some new normal that reasserts itself? How does government, the public sector, some form of democratic accountability begin to play a role in some of these time-limited emergency approaches? And what do the structures look like?
Well, if Henry, you'll excuse me for taking just a moment. I think it's really important to answer that question, to sort of roll the tape back a little bit, Elwood, because Detroit went through very distinctive phases of governance. And in each one, there was a sort of a modification and a forward move. And I think there is sort of the temptation to think that those were all just sort of workarounds, and at some point you just sort of fall back to where you began. And I don't think that's what happened in Detroit. We started with a very strong command and control structure under Coleman Young and his successors. We then went through this horrible perfect storm of disaster in the 2008 to 2010 period I mentioned. Philanthropy then had to step in and try to create some scaffolding around issues of small business development and transit and land use and arts and culture and education. Then we went through the bankruptcy, which kind of threw everything up in the air and let it come down again. And ultimately, when we got through that, we were able to sort of resume an elected mayor and city council structure, which had been suspended during the bankruptcy. And the private sector had sort of gotten back on its feet and had begun to contribute to the reimagination of the city. And so at that point, I think there was an assumption in both the private and the public sectors that we would just sort of snap back into sort of the old system of the sector sort of getting back into their lanes, playing kind of a narrow role, and letting each other kind of do what it does best. And there was some of that, but I would argue that there was a fundamental reset, a fundamental recalibration because of all of the things that we've talked about so far. A recognition that philanthropy can play different roles, that the private sector can play different roles, that the public sector can be more of an orchestrator and less of a command and controlling presence. And so my sense is that the structures you put in place have to be flexible, have to be adaptable. Sometimes they have to be quasi-permanent. We've created a number of conservancies that will be existing in perpetuity, but sometimes they kind of morph and shapeshift as situations change. We started with a blight task force, for example, many years ago in Detroit to try to get at all of the vacant and abandoned properties in the city. That was done under the mayor's control. But over time, it became clear that the order of magnitude of that challenge was so large that you had to have philanthropic dollars and private resources into the mix. So I don't mean to say everything sort of depends, but a lot of it depends. And sometimes permanency is important, sometimes adaptability is important, and sometimes trying something for a while and discarding it is important. And we've done all three in Detroit.
I think it's important to stress that none of these things ever comes to conclusion. There's no such thing as the millennium in city life. It goes on, and you can never claim success or victory truly, because circumstances morph and you're on to the next problem. And despite the successes that San Antonio's had, and I've described, for example, what we've done in the education sphere and some of the successes that came from Target 90, at the same time, we have a deep and abiding poverty in our city. And I don't think we've figured out exactly the root causes and how we're going to address it going forward. And you think you make progress, and then you have a pandemic that wipes people out financially, that closes small businesses and leaves people in food lines for food a mile long in their cars in the worst of the pandemic. And I think the implications of the kind of poverty side effects that we're going to have, homelessness as people are evicted, et cetera, we haven't even yet begun to tap. So I think whatever we've learned through this process, we're going to have to apply it again. And in my instinct, there is a two-part challenge before us. The first is we have to pull people together and try to understand what is the root cause of this poverty we're confronting. What are the one or two or three most fundamentally important things we have to do, and let's do them together. And then the second is we have a lot of dollars in town. We may not have them to deploy on the problem today from the public sector, but there's a lot of funding that goes to things that could be redirected if we decided this was the most important thing we needed to do. So although we have a very rich tradition of philanthropy going to the symphony, to arts organizations, to art museums, and other things, maybe when we get in the room, we'll find out we need to break some of those habits a little bit, some of those streams, and put it into these other areas that are almost existential in terms of our ability to build a functioning society. And then we have people who are well-intentioned, have been doing certain things in the youth area, for example, or in serving the elderly in traditional ways. That's been the habit. They think they have it right, but it's a drop in the bucket. It's not really helping many. How do we combine them with others, get them to step outside their tradition a little bit and do this differently so we can get at some of the root causes we've identified? It's a very difficult conversation that we need to have, because people like doing what they have been doing and don't want to slip into a different pattern mold network. But I mean, if we're going to deal with the equity questions, I don't think the answers are going to come from Washington. I don't think the solutions are going to come from Washington. They have massive deficit problems. They have philosophical debates about the purpose and size of government. They have a deadlock partisanly. The states, as I mentioned before, they've not shown great any ambition to be involved in the equity conversation. We at the city level don't have any choice. we have to step over homeless people walking down the sidewalk, and watch people be without food and without power, et cetera. So I think the next big challenge is to figure how we make these models that we've been discussing here today work in really, really tough situations. Detroit has given us a model in that sense, because the Detroit situation was as bad as it gets. But what we're confronting now in terms of structural poverty, the poverty that comes from economic dislocation, may be just as tough on a broader scale across the country.
The two of you have been leading this conversation intentionally headlong into a question of equity. Let's talk about some of these deep-rooted economic divides, and also about racial equity in particular. And I know you've both spoken so passionately about this not being addressed as a silo issue, but as something that has to permeate all of our urban systems. And Henry, you used the term once that cities can be a platform for exploring racial equity, like a system for exploring racial equity. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that, and what it would look like to realize that vision?
Over the years, I've heard people use the word intentionality. And as I said a moment ago, cities have been doing an equity function for a long time, maybe as long as cities have existed, but certainly American cities have. It's where immigrants have gone, it's where migrants have gone, it's where people who start poor and in several generations because they create a business or because they go to college and become professionals and advance. But we've never brought intentionality to the function of the city with respect to equity. We're doing other things. We're picking up the garbage, cleaning the streets, putting the police on, and more recently, we've taken on new functions, running airports, convention centers, urban renewal programs, et cetera. And we've gotten into the economic development business, small business strategies, downtown redevelopments, et cetera, but never really brought an intentional equity lens to that work. And if we did, I think we could make a big difference. It might start with, for example, early childhood education. It might start with some of the neediest cases of elderly who were without nutrition and care. But it would also include worker training, education through K through 12 and college, home ownership opportunities, small business development and entrepreneurial development, but all of those things that move people up the ladder, that give people a chance to move to the middle class, that reward them for the hard work that they do, that create the incentives to do the hard work, to go to school, to create the business, and so forth. I think the time has come to talk about it. Mayor de Blasio ran his first campaign, and then to a lesser degree, his second campaign on these themes. And I think he made some progress. So he started an important conversation. I'm seeing this idea spreading in cities for a variety of reasons. One, we have a generation of young people who understand it. They want to try their hand at it. They're entrepreneurial and energetic and ambitious. That's great. Secondly, we've seen how these tools work on a small basis. We need to just graduate to look at them more systemically. And thirdly, I don't think we have any choice, because so many of the other factors in our society are going in the opposite direction, from downsizing of companies to offshoring of jobs, to the loss of industry sectors, to practices with respect to worker wages. So many factors working against us on the equity front that I don't think we have any choice but to figure out how to counter them.
Rip, what are your thoughts? How do you embrace the term equity at the Kresge Foundation?
Well, it's hard to improve on what Henry said. A number of months ago, Kresge tried to figure out how it could corral its resources in support of a more intentional approach to racial equity and justice, and we developed a package. It's on one hand, you kind of lead with the money, and we developed a $30 million fund that would move us in that direction. But it became really clear really fast that this was about more than the money. No amount of money in the world can accomplish this if it's not done properly. And one of the realizations we had is exactly what Henry said, is that attacking issues of racial inequity is an exercise in comprehensive development. It's as much about arts and culture as it is about human services, as it is about infrastructure, as it is about education. And all of those things, of course, are interrelated tightly. And so as we developed our package, we realized that although it was tempting just to direct resources simply to people who were doing organizing and protesting and calling out inequities on the ground, it also needed to go to arts and cultural organizations, to human service organizations, to environmental organizations, to educational institutions. And so we decided that a couple of principles would guide us. First is that it had to be locally based. We can have a national conversation about race and reconciliation and healing, and we should and will and are. But at the end of the day, it's got to land, I think, where people live, where people organize, and where people map out the rest of their life patterns. And so what we did was to dedicate most of our funding, and we gave it to about 60 or 70 organizations, to community-based organizations in Detroit, Memphis, New Orleans, and Fresno. But then we coupled them with national organizations like the NAACP and others who were working on issues of a similar kind and who could sort of see across the landscape to help someone in Fresno attach to someone in San Antonio who was doing really innovative work, or to make sure that the people in Memphis were talking to the people in Detroit, and that all of those folks were backed up with adequate communications, adequate data, adequate legal support. And so I think as we proceed, we've simply got to recognize, one, that you've just got to steel yourself for the long term. These are long norms and rules and biases in the making, and they're going to be a long time in the unraveling. But two, it's got to also be an exercise in building a movement. And again, to go back to some of the themes we've been talking about earlier, it's a problem-solving machinery. It's a civic capacity building machinery that we want to make sure that all of the energies that were directed in the aftermath of George Floyd toward protest and anger and mobilization ultimately get translated into building the capacity of people on the ground, particularly people of color, to have real influence in the way decisions are made in their community. And so from a philanthropic perspective, philanthropy has absolutely no choice but to be all in. We want to be all in. We accept an ethical and sort of moral imperative for being all in, but it's also very practical. This is where the future is going. I think Henry is exactly right. We have no choice but to design a whole new set of mechanisms that make sure that these issues of justice and equity and opportunity are thought through in a very different way, in a very much more locally based and powerful way.
I have I have a kind of a big final question about urban policy, but before I get to that, I want to pick up on this theme that Henry raised about economic mobility and people, entrepreneurial spirit, and also a phrase you used, Rip, about ecosystems and ecologies in support of entrepreneurial efforts. I think it's very easy at a time of crisis for people to think that the answer is for a city to attract and retain a big industry or something. But I know that both of you have invoked the power of small businesses as being critical to a model of growth for a city. And you've talked about in different ways the need for supportive ecosystems for entrepreneurship. Henry, can you say a little bit on that topic, either what the difference is between a robust ecosystem and one that's kind of meager, or any thoughts you have on how you build that?
Well, first of all, I'm absolutely convinced that the net under a city is the network of small businesses. And that even though we would celebrate in the front page of the newspaper, or at least the front page of the business section, a company that's bringing 500 or 1,000 jobs, that we're creating 500 or 1,000 jobs in small businesses every month, and no one shares the credit for that or expresses the credit for that, because they're just out there. It's just happening. A company adds 2 workers or an additional worker to a 5-person firm. But it's happening out there across the city. I think we need to think through the whole element of all the elements of the support system. I don't know a single city in America, and I've been looking at this for a long time, where you could say the explosion of economic opportunity under the city, carrying it forward, is entrepreneurship and small business. Now, one possible exception to that might be Miami, where the Cuban community came so entrepreneurially skilled. These were people who were skillful engineers in Cuba, came here and drove taxi cabs until they just couldn't do it anymore, and they decided they were going to use their skills. And until the society opened up and let them get a bank loan to start that business, that engineering firm, and eventually they became bankers and members of bank boards themselves. But there's this massive sort of entrepreneurial spirit that you see in Miami. I haven't really seen that in other places. There are other exceptions where it's visible, like the Dominican community in New York City, for example, 1 million strong now and prospering. A lot of bodegas and other elements of activity. So as mayor and also as chairman of the Chamber of Commerce here, I really put an emphasis on the things that are elements: bonding for small businesses, training for entrepreneurs, not training in the formal sense. You don't need an MBA or even a bachelor's degree. You need to know what you need to know to select the right site, to focus on your skill set, to learn something about taxes and business accounting, et cetera. So we set up programs to help people who wanted to be in business. A woman who was known in her family for her cooking and has always wanted to set up a restaurant, to get the assistance to actually do it. And there are all kinds of smaller businesses, cosmetics and hair care and nails, et cetera, small mechanic shops, all kinds of things that are not glamorous, what the mayor of Boston used to call the back streets economy. As I say, I don't know of cities that have broken that code, but I think it is a very, very important piece of how we advance the equity agenda. Because, and I'll close with this, when a person starts a business, the whole family is involved. There's a good chance if it succeeds, it can be multi-generational. And the next generation of the family. So many cases of Latinos that I know in construction, in masonry, in asphalt work, in roofing, in plumbing are that way. They're in the 3rd generation of the family business. They have a little freedom because now they have some resources that they can buy things. They buy a bigger house, they buy a warehouse, they buy more trucks, they buy things for themselves. They have some net worth for the first time. They have some free time. They can be in civic service. We have suppliers to an automotive company here, Toyota, that each of them now has had a major civic role as one of our heads, chair of one of our major civic enterprises, our transit system, our water system, our power system. Because they're smart people, they prove themselves, they have confidence that came out of their small businesses. I'm a big, big fan, as you might tell.
Yeah, there, an excellent answer. Rip, any lessons we can draw from Detroit?
Well, it's such a powerful answer, and Detroit is not Miami, but it's not possible to understand Detroit's resurgence without understanding the building of an entrepreneurial ecology in the city. There really was no tradition of entrepreneurialism in Detroit prior to 2010, 2011. The autos would sort of spec out their requirements and people would push them into supply chain, and it was creative work, but it wasn't entrepreneurial work. It was very passive, receptive work. And so we very deliberately over the next decade set out to create an entrepreneurial ecology, an infrastructure of supporting small businesses. Many of the things that Henry just mentioned, technical assistance, black box space, networks of business organizations that could be supportive, money, early stage capital, the whole bit. And as those things began to accrete, then all of a sudden Goldman Sachs found a landing place, and then JP Morgan Chase found a landing place, and then Quicken Loans found a landing place. And I would argue that despite the big presence of Quicken and a couple of other of our big industries, that Detroit really is becoming a city of small businesses, and it needs to. One of the great tragedies of COVID is that of the 61,000 small businesses in the city of Detroit, about 85% of those are owned by people of color in the city of Detroit. And of those 85%, only about 2% employ more than 2 people. So you can imagine the fragility of that system, and yet the potential that Henry describes for those to sort of blossom into something bigger and more enduring. So the only quick things I would add, Elwood, is that in addition to building the sort of ecology of supports, you also need a very different community finance system. As we've gone through COVID and watched how money moves or doesn't move into community, we've seen time and time again these small entrepreneurs of color get passed by. It's not through any ill will, it's just the rigidity of commercial lending formulas and just the way everything is sort of structured to move capital doesn't work for them. And so in Detroit, we're having to, one more time, sort of reimagine what it means to distribute money into community through very different structures of capital and through very different flows of capital. And finally, I would say that it's, at least in Detroit, it's impossible to separate small business development from larger community development. Small businesses don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in corridors, they exist in residential areas, they exist along transit lines, they exist next to schools and to early childhood centers. And so trying to figure out how you create these sort of mutually supportive systems that ultimately create the kinds of environments in which small business can thrive is really the ultimate challenge of any city, particularly one like Detroit, where there's been such a long and sort of sordid history of disinvestment.
If I may, I'd like to ask a final question. And that's about, it's a national policy question, but I'd like to ask it in a very specific way, given that so much of this discussion has focused on local civic capacity. And I guess I'd like to ask, do we have opportunities to envision a federal response to the challenges we're facing that uses these local structures that exist at the local level to help resources land in the most effective way? And maybe I'd like to start with you, Henry, to say, for an agency like HUD, how can an organization like HUD be responsive at this time? And what thoughts do you have about the optimal distribution of roles between the federal, state, and local government?
Well, I'm involved in this very question at the moment, so it's a timely issue because the federal government is starting to organize the infrastructure package that will follow the COVID relief package that we hope will pass this week, and then by April and May, the conversation will be about the makeup of the large infrastructure package. And I've been making the argument through the U.S. Conference of Mayors, through the National League of Cities, through a group called Accelerator for America, and others, that there needs to be a local voice in that. To me, the logic is so clear. If we're a metropolitan nation and our metropolitan areas are the keys to our national economy, and we want to do infrastructure because we need it to support our economic future, then shouldn't we involve those who know what they need at the local level? And not do sort of top-down siloed strategies because the congressional committees are set up that way, or because the cabinet departments are set up that way. 9 congressional committees are involved in infrastructure decisions, for example. But shouldn't we have some mechanism where we can listen, at least consult with local leaders about what they need to address their future? So this has to be more than just abstract discussion. We have to have mechanisms. There are few that would serve the purpose. I just participated in a survey of the 100 largest cities and their infrastructure priorities, which proves the answers are out there. if we had the systems to check it. I have to believe in an age of computerization and information technology, we can find out, we can survey people, we can poll people and find out what their needs are and work back up. I also believe there's some mechanisms in place, like the metropolitan planning organizations for transportation across a region, like the councils of government that exists, and of course, the local governments themselves in a network of listening to nonprofits and philanthropy and others. But I think we need to begin to think about how we flip the traditional structure of federal grant and aid on its head so we can hear what the needs are in the communities. I tried to do that in the short time that I had to work it at HUD and really make our federal field offices information pipelines to get information back as to what HUD could do for them. But it's amazing to me, this far along in our sophistication as governmental organizations, bureaucracy, if you will, that we haven't been able to create the mechanisms where we listen to the bottom of the pyramid.
Rip?
I think that Henry's admonition that we flip the script, flip the pyramid, is so important. And if I could, just a quick waterfall of a couple vignettes that suggest to me that you actually can do this. Right when President Obama took over in 2009, 2010, I got a call from his domestic policy council saying, I just got out of a cabinet meeting with the president, and he vowed that Detroit would not become the Katrina on his watch. And so we want to come to Detroit and announce something. And I said, well, that's great. What do you want to announce? They said, well, I don't know. I just want to announce something. And I know, all right, well, that's not so helpful. So I went back and tried to sort of organize some thoughts about what that might look like. And we went to work on it. And so shortly thereafter, one of Henry's successors, very powerful, effective Secretary Sean Donovan, asked if I would have dinner with him. And he said, I've heard about your conversation with the Domestic Policy Council. And my question is a little bit more specific. I want to know where I can land a suite of federal investments in City Hall, because that's kind of the mechanism that we've got to work with. And I to this day, regret the conversation because I had to tell the secretary that I didn't think that was going to work. That at that point, City Hall was in such disarray and had such low capacity that pouring money into that vessel just simply wouldn't accomplish what it needed to accomplish. And to his enormous credit, Donovan then went about the business of trying to figure out how then to create greater support for local government. And he created something called the Smart City, Smart Community Initiative, located people in about a half a dozen cities across the country, including Detroit, to try to begin helping do exactly what Henry suggests, which is sort of get intelligence on the ground and work the process. But then the third call suggested to me that the Obama administration actually was beginning to get it, because it was right after the bankruptcy was announced. And Gene Sperling of the president's office called and he said, I'm so sorry you guys are in bankruptcy. There's really nothing we can do. We can't get anything through the Congress. We can't forgive your bond obligations. We can't do anything, but we want to come and make an announcement. And I said, what is it with you guys and announcements? What do you want to announce? He said, well, I don't know. We'll come and figure something out. And I said, no. Why don't we in Detroit gather our best thinking around 5 or 6 of your major priorities where you believe you have some discretion, and send you back a series of ideas that then you can bounce around your cabinet. And so we did that. We took a couple of weeks and looked at public safety and housing and transportation and tech and civic capacity and a couple of other things. And Sperling then called me a number of weeks later saying, that was great. I've circulated this to all of our agencies, and I'd like you and a handful of others from Detroit to come out and sort of walk us through the document, and we'll use it as a working document. So we show up in the cabinet in the West Wing in the big conference room, and there is sitting every frigging cabinet member in the Obama administration, including Eric Holder and Valerie Jarrett and Cecilia Munoz. I mean, just everyone and their cabinets. And we spent hours going through these analyses that the local community had prepared about where they believed existing federal flows could be made more efficient, where some of the regulatory burdens could be lifted, where we were sort of hitting a wall in terms of federal applications for certain things, and it was all very productive. So Sperling then took another couple of weeks, sort of reconciled all of that around the cabinets, created little working groups, and then called me back and he said, Rip, I think we got something. I think, we've taken these 5 or 6 categories. We've lined up what you've given us. We've lined up what we think we can do. We're shifting some money from Cincinnati over here. We're loosening up regulations over here. And I said, so what did you come up with, Gene? And he said, well, I want to come and announce something. And I said, so now you have something to announce? And he said, yes, actually we do. It's a $300 million package in which if you'll come up with about 50 million of it, we believe that the other 250 million can be done essentially through reallocation of resources from places that aren't using them or where we've got some flexibility. And I've got to tell you that coming out of bankruptcy, it was probably the single most important thing that could have been done in the city, because it jump-started our vacant housing rehab program, it jump-started our transit program, it jump-started our technology program, and it was an enormously powerful example of how the federal government, if they're willing to listen and sort of work the ground, can actually make a difference. Now, you can't do that to 1,000 cities across the country, but it demonstrated, I think, to Henry's point, that you can redesign and you can recalibrate. And when you do it, it's a very, very powerful model.
It is indeed. Gentlemen, I feel, as I'm sure our audience does today, that I have been sitting at the hem of not one, but two Aristotles. So thank you for helping us to understand the enormity of the moment we're in, but also through your reflection and through your generous intellect to see that there are paths through this. I hope that we can prevail upon you to join us here again at the center as situations in cities, to your point, Henry, continue to unfold in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. Rip, always good to be with you.
Thank you. And wherever Henry goes, I will follow. So just let me know.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.